A widow's desperate prayer for love collided with fate at a most unexpected venue, an auction where broken dreams were sold to the highest bidder. She never imagined that the man with the cowboy hat and shattered past would be carrying the very answer her heart had been seeking all along. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dust danced in the late afternoon sunlight as Mary Johnson made her way through the crowded auction grounds of Silver Creek. At 6 months pregnant, her steps were careful but determined, one hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly, while the other clutched a worn leather purse containing nearly all she had left in the world. The weekly auction had drawn the usual crowd: farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk looking for bargains or simply there to gossip. Mary felt their stares like physical touches. Mrs. Simmons and her friends huddled near the pie stand, their whispers barely concealed behind cupped hands. "Poor thing," they said, not meaning it. Husband barely cold in the ground and her in that condition? Their pity was performative, their judgment real. The young widow kept her chin up despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. 3 months since Thomas had passed, leaving her with a half-built cottage, dwindling savings, and a baby on the way. The cottage needed repairs before winter came, and she needed help, the kind that wouldn't drain what little money remained. Starting bid at $2, the auctioneer called from his platform, his voice carrying across the square. Mary pushed through the crowd, ignoring the way conversations faltered as she passed. Her blue calico dress, let out twice already to accommodate her growing belly, marked her as clearly as any sign might have. "Mary Johnson, out shopping again?" Old Mr. Peterson's voice carried more curiosity than kindness. "Thought your cupboards might be bare by now." She offered a tight smile, but no response. The truth was her cupboards were indeed nearly empty. The garden Thomas had planted yielded some vegetables, but it wasn't enough. Winter loomed like a predator, patient and inevitable. "Lord, just show me something," she whispered, a prayer carried away by the dusty breeze. "Anything to help us survive." A group of young men from the cattle ranch north of town snickered as she passed. One elbowed another, nodding in her direction. "Reckon she's looking for a new husband already?" Mary clutched her purse tighter, feeling the meager weight of the coins inside. $15.37, everything she had managed to save. Not enough for hired help, barely enough for supplies. She moved toward the back of the crowd where household items would soon be auctioned, hoping for tools she could manage herself. Each step through the square felt heavier than the last. Doubt shadowed her like a persistent cloud, whispering that perhaps the neighbors were right, that a woman alone, especially one with child, couldn't possibly survive without surrendering her independence or pride. Still, Mary kept walking, her prayers for protection and love repeating with each heartbeat, even as fear threatened to drown them out. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Next up, folks, what am I bid for this one?" Mary Johnson's attention snapped toward the wooden platform where a man stood with slumped shoulders. The crowd parted slightly, revealing Robert Smith in full, painful view. He was a sorry sight indeed. Once perhaps a strong ranch hand, Robert now stood bent like a question mark, his body betraying years of hard labor and injury. His weathered face told stories of suffering, eyes downcast and hollow. A jagged scar ran along his forearm, visible where his threadbare shirt failed to cover it. The stoop in his posture suggested a back injury that had never properly healed. "Oh, give me $2 for this broken-down cowboy," the auctioneer called, his tone dismissive. "Still got some work left in him, maybe. Good for simple chores, if nothing else." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Not worth the food he'd eat," someone shouted from the back. Another voice added, "My dog's got more use than him." More cruel chuckles followed. Mary felt her baby shift inside her as she studied the man. While others saw only damage, she noticed how his calloused hands were clean despite his circumstances. His clothes, though worn thin, had been carefully mended. There was dignity in how he endured the mockery without flinching. $1, the auctioneer tried again. Surely someone needs an extra hand around their property. Silence fell. No one raised a hand. Something stirred in Mary's heart, a recognition perhaps. Wasn't she also deemed worthless by many in Silver Creek? A pregnant widow with no prospects, living on borrowed sympathy and dwindling resources. 50 cents, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. Heads turned, expressions ranging from shock to pity to amusement. 50 cents from the widow Johnson, the auctioneer announced, eyebrows raised. Going once? Mary clutched her worn purse tighter. The money inside represented her safety net for the coming week, but something about Robert's quiet dignity compelled her forward. Going twice. Their eyes met briefly. In that fleeting moment, Mary glimpsed something unexpected, not just despair, but a flicker of something luminous and resilient. Sold, to the widow for 50 cents. As Mary approached the platform, whispers followed her like shadows. She ignored them, focusing instead on Robert Smith as he carefully made his way down the steps, each movement clearly causing him pain. When he finally stood before her, he didn't speak, but the slight bow of his head conveyed both gratitude and uncertainty about what would come next. Mary Johnson held her head high as she led Robert Smith away from the auction grounds. The villagers' laughter followed them like a swarm of angry hornets, their cruel whispers carrying on the afternoon breeze. Poor foolish widow, someone muttered loud enough for her to hear. Wasting good money on broken goods. Mary's cheeks burned, but she refused to quicken her pace or show any sign that their words affected her. The walk to her cottage at the edge of Silver Creek was mercifully short. Robert limped beside her, his breathing labored but steady. She noticed how he straightened his stooped shoulders whenever they passed anyone on the dusty road, as if determined not to confirm their judgments. "It's not much," she said apologetically, as they approached the small, weathered structure she called home. The garden out front was overgrown, her late husband's tools still leaning against the porch, where he'd left them months ago. Mary expected silence from her new companion, perhaps even regret. What could a man who'd just been auctioned off like cattle possibly have to say? She busied herself preparing a simple meal, unsure how to navigate this strange new arrangement. But Robert surprised her. After washing his hands and face at the basin, he reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. "May I show you something?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd expected. Mary nodded, curiosity overcoming her nervousness. The ranch hand carefully opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with delicate sketches of landscapes, animals, and people caught in moments of quiet dignity. Between the drawings were poems, some just a few lines, others filling entire pages, written in a careful, measured hand. "I've been writing these for years," he explained, turning the pages slowly. "Prayers, mostly, for someone to love and care for." One particular sketch caught her eye, a woman standing alone in a field, her hand resting protectively over her belly. The resemblance to her own situation was uncanny. "I drew that last week," Robert said, noticing her gaze, "before I knew where I'd end up." Mary's throat tightened as she realized what she was seeing. This man, dismissed as worthless by everyone in Silver Creek, carried within him a soul of surprising depth and sensitivity. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the notebook. As she turned the pages, each poem and drawing revealed another piece of Robert's heart, his hopes, his loneliness, his unwavering faith that someday he would find purpose. With stunning clarity, Mary understood that in her desperate bid at the auction, she had unknowingly answered his deepest yearning. Robert Smith's body betrayed him with every movement. His left leg dragged slightly behind, a permanent reminder of the accident that had cost him his previous job at the Henderson Ranch. Yet determination burned in his eyes as he refused Mary Johnson's pleas to rest. "I may not be whole, ma'am, but I'm not useless," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm as he examined the leaking roof corner. "This cottage needs attention before the next rain comes." Mary watched with a mixture of concern and admiration as Robert climbed the rickety ladder she'd propped against the wall. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, protecting the life growing within. 6 months along now, she knew time was precious. "The village thinks I've lost my mind," she confessed, handing him the hammer he'd requested. "Mrs. Peterson stopped me at the well yesterday. Said I'd wasted my money on a broken man who couldn't possibly provide." Robert paused, his weathered hands gripping the roof beam. "And what did you tell her?" "That some things can't be measured by what's visible to the eye." A hint of a smile crossed his face as he returned to his work, hammering with surprising precision for someone whose hands trembled when at rest. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek. Children would peek through the garden fence, curious about the strange arrangement. Older folks whispered behind cupped hands when Mary and Robert passed by the general store. Some predictions were dire, that she'd starve before winter's end, with a useless man and a baby to feed. But inside the small cottage, a different story unfolded. They established routines that played to each other's strengths. Mary could cook and mend, while Robert, despite his limitations, proved remarkably resourceful. He fashioned a series of rabbit traps that kept their table supplied with meat. His knowledge of which wild plants were edible expanded their meals beyond what Mary's meager savings could provide. They celebrated small victories, a repaired fence, a successful batch of preserves, with the kind of quiet joy neither had experienced in years. When Robert's legs seized up after too much exertion, Mary would read aloud from his notebook of poems, the words filling their small home with unexpected beauty. "I never thought I'd laugh again," Mary admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, the day's work behind them. The ranch hand looked up from the piece of wood he was carving into a toy for the coming child. "Neither did I," he said softly. "Funny how life surprises you that way." The rain pounded against the cottage roof like an impatient visitor, waking Mary Johnson from her fitful sleep. Her hands instinctively moved to her swollen belly, protecting the life growing within. 6 months along now, the baby's movements had become more pronounced, a constant reminder of both her joy and her fears. A soft melody drifted through the darkness, barely audible above the storm. Mary sat up, straining to hear. It was Robert's voice, low and gentle, coming from the small room adjacent to hers where he slept on a makeshift bed of straw and blankets. "Little one I've yet to meet, stars will guide your tiny feet," he sang, his voice carrying a tenderness that made Mary's breath catch. "Though the world seems cold and wide, I'll stand forever by your side." She eased herself from bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and moved toward the doorway. Robert Smith sat by the window, his notebook open on his lap, scribbling by the faint light of a candle stub. His stooped shoulders seemed less burdened as he worked, humming between verses. "A lullaby," he explained, without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "For the child. I hope they'll like it." Mary leaned against the doorframe, watching this man whom Silver Creek had discarded as worthless. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Robert turned then, his face half illuminated by the candle's glow. "I wrote many for the family I always hoped to have, never thought anyone would hear them." The pregnant widow felt tears well up in her eyes, but they weren't born of the sorrow that had been her constant companion since losing her husband. These tears came from somewhere deeper, a wellspring of hope she'd thought had run dry months ago. "Would you sing it again?" she asked. As Robert's melody filled the small cottage once more, Mary closed her eyes. The warmth of his voice wrapped around her like a blanket, more comforting than any she'd known since being left alone. In that moment, she understood something profound. Love didn't always arrive with trumpets and declarations. Sometimes it came quietly, in a hand that fixed a leaking roof, in a shared meal prepared with care, in a lullaby written for a child not yet born. The midwife's warnings echoed in her mind, but here in the darkness they seemed less threatening. Mary realized that what she and Robert were building, this fragile, unexpected partnership, might be stronger than anything she had dared to pray for. "Sometimes," Robert said, softly as he finished the song, "the things we need most find us when we've stopped looking." Mary nodded, her hand still resting on her belly. The baby kicked, as if in agreement. The morning sun filtered through the cottage windows as Mary Johnson stood at the wooden table, demonstrating how to knead dough with practiced hands. Robert watched intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. His fingers, calloused from years of ranch work, struggled with the delicate task. "Like this," Mary guided, placing her hands over his. "Not too rough. The bread needs gentleness to rise properly." Robert Smith nodded, his movements becoming more fluid under her instruction. Though his hands trembled slightly from old injuries, his determination never wavered. By the third attempt, he produced a misshapen but perfectly edible loaf that brought a proud smile to his face. "You're a natural," Mary encouraged, her hand resting briefly on her growing belly. In return for her culinary lessons, Robert took Mary to the edge of the woods behind their cottage. "My father taught me to read the forest," he explained, pointing to subtle signs she'd never noticed: disturbed soil near berry bushes, the particular arrangement of twigs that indicated animal pathways. With patient instruction, he showed her how to identify edible berries, distinguishing the sweet from the poisonous. His hands, so awkward with dough, moved with surprising dexterity as he demonstrated how to set simple rabbit traps. "The trick isn't force," the ranch hand explained, "but understanding what the animal needs." Their days fell into a rhythm of mutual teaching and learning. When the fire needed tending, Robert was there before Mary could rise from her chair. When his leg pained him after long hours of work, she prepared a poultice of herbs without being asked. The villagers of Silver Creek continued their whispers whenever the unlikely pair visited the square for supplies. Yet within the walls of their modest home, judgment couldn't reach them. They celebrated small victories: a perfectly baked pie, a successful trap that brought meat to their table, a leak fixed before the rain could damage their supplies. One evening, as they sat by the hearth eating rabbit stew, Mary noticed Robert watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I never thought anyone would look at me and see something worth saving," he admitted, vulnerability raw in his voice. Mary's eyes glistened in the firelight. "And I never imagined finding strength when I felt most helpless." They sat in comfortable silence, the crackling fire punctuating the moment. Through shared struggles and quiet triumphs, the knock on the cottage door came just as Mary Johnson was hanging freshly washed linens to dry. She opened it to find Mrs. Brown, the town midwife, standing with her weathered leather bag and a face pinched with concern. "I've come to check on you," the older woman announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her sharp eyes took in the modest but tidy interior before settling on Robert, who was mending a chair in the corner. Mrs. Brown examined Mary with practiced hands, measuring her growing belly and listening to her heartbeat. When she finished, she pulled Mary aside, voice low but not quite private. "You're risking everything, Mary. This pregnancy could take your life, and this man," she eyed Robert with suspicion, "can't possibly protect you. What happens when the baby comes and complications arise? What then?" Mary felt her throat tighten. The midwife's words echoed her own midnight fears, fears she'd been pushing away with prayer and determination. "I'm stronger than I look," she whispered, one hand protectively covering her belly. Mrs. Brown shook her head. Strength won't matter if your body fails you. And him? Her gaze flicked toward Robert. A broken man can't save anyone. After the midwife left, silence filled the cottage. Robert had heard every word. His shoulders hunched as he stared at his scarred hands. "Maybe she's right," Mary said finally, tears threatening. "Maybe I've been foolish to think—" "No." Robert stood, his voice firmer than she'd ever heard it. "We won't let fear decide our path." That afternoon, while Mary rested, Robert limped into the surrounding woods. His determination outweighed his pain as he gathered medicinal herbs he recognized from his years working ranches: yarrow for bleeding, chamomile for calm, raspberry leaf to ease childbirth. He traded his poems to a passing merchant for extra blankets and spent hours chopping and stacking firewood until his hands blistered and bled. When Mary awoke, she found him organizing his bounty: herbs hanging to dry from the rafters, blankets folded neatly, enough firewood to last through any storm. "What is all this?" she asked, amazed. Robert smiled, the haunted look in his eyes replaced with purpose. "Preparation. The midwife isn't wrong about the dangers, but she's wrong about me. I may be broken in body, but not in spirit." He took her hand gently. "We'll be ready, Mary, for whatever comes." That night, as they sat by the fire, Mary realized that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about facing fears together, with open eyes and willing hearts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Mary Johnson ventured beyond the edge of Silver Creek, her swollen belly making each step more deliberate than the last. She had come searching for medicinal roots that Mrs. Brown had once mentioned grew near the canyon's edge. Her basket hung from one arm while her other hand instinctively rested on her rounded stomach. The rocky terrain proved challenging, but Mary persisted, driven by the need to prepare for her child's arrival. As she rounded a cluster of boulders, the sound of water caught her attention. Following the gentle murmur, she discovered a hidden spring bubbling up from between two ancient rocks, creating a small, crystal-clear pool before trickling down into the canyon below. "Robert," she called out, her voice echoing against the stone walls. "Come see what I've found." Robert Smith appeared moments later, his limp more pronounced after the uphill climb. His eyes widened at the sight of the pristine water source. "This changes everything," he whispered. Kneeling beside the spring despite the effort it cost him, he dipped his hand into the cool water and smiled. "Clean water, right here. No more hauling buckets from the village well." Over the next few days, Robert taught Mary how to purify the spring water, using heated stones and simple filtering techniques he'd learned during his years working ranches across the territory. His hands, though weathered and sometimes unsteady, moved with surprising precision as he fashioned a small net from materials in their cottage. "The stream below has fish," he explained, demonstrating how to cast the handmade net. "Small ones, but plenty enough for us." Mary watched him with growing admiration. The man the villagers had dismissed as worthless was revealing depths of knowledge that transformed their modest home into a haven of self-sufficiency. One evening, as they carried their day's harvest back to the cottage, Mary paused to catch her breath. Looking at their small home, now stocked with fresh water, fish, and wild herbs, she felt a surge of security she hadn't known since before her husband's passing. "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Robert nodded, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "This isn't just about surviving anymore," he said quietly. "We're building something." Mary understood then that their partnership had evolved beyond mere necessity. What had begun as a desperate gamble at the auction block had transformed into something powerful, a bond forged through shared effort and growing devotion. Their little family, unconventional as it might be, had found its foundation not in the approval of Silver Creek, but in the strength they discovered in each other. As the winter months melted into spring, Silver Creek began to take notice of the unlikely pair at the edge of town. Mary Johnson's cottage, once a place of whispered pity, now stood as a testament to quiet resilience. The garden flourished with early vegetables, smoke curled steadily from the chimney, and the sound of occasional laughter drifted across the fields. "I don't understand how they manage," Martha Wilson muttered to her husband as they passed in their wagon. "That broken cowboy can barely walk straight, and she's heavy with child, yet their garden looks better than ours." Such conversations happened frequently in the village square. Some neighbors watched Mary and Robert with narrowed eyes, their jealousy poorly disguised as concern. "Something's not right about it," they'd whisper. "How does a crippled ranch hand and a widow with no family support make ends meet so well?" Others, like old Mr. Peterson, who had lost his own wife years ago, observed with grudging respect. "Leave them be," he'd say when the gossip grew too harsh. "They work harder than most, with twice their advantages." Mary became aware of the stares whenever she ventured into town for supplies. She felt the weight of judgment pressing against her shoulders, but found it easier to bear with each passing day. What once would have crushed her spirit, now merely rolled off her back like spring rain. "They're talking again," she told Robert one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "Taylor practically twisted her neck watching us at the general store today." Robert looked up from the rabbit trap he was mending. "Let them talk," he said softly. "Words can't take away what we've built." And they had built something remarkable. Their small homestead thrived, not despite their challenges, but because of how they faced them together. When Robert's leg pained him too much to fetch water, Mary would go instead. When her pregnancy made bending difficult, he would carefully harvest the lower vegetables. They had created a dance of mutual support that made them far stronger than either could be alone. "I never thought I'd be grateful for the auction," Mary admitted, watching the firelight play across his face. "But every challenge we overcome makes me more certain." Robert nodded, understanding the unspoken truth between them. The village might never fully accept their unusual partnership, but their opinions mattered less with each passing day. What had begun as an arrangement of desperate necessity had transformed into something neither had dared hope for, a foundation of trust that could weather any storm. The embers glowed orange in the small stone hearth, casting long shadows across Mary Johnson's cottage. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees of Silver Creek, a gentle backdrop to the crackling fire. Mary sat in her rocking chair, her swollen belly a testament to the life growing within her, while Robert Smith occupied the wooden stool he had repaired himself. "Would you like some tea?" Mary asked, reaching for the kettle. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if each gesture carried the weight of her unborn child. Robert nodded, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Something in his posture had changed tonight, a tension that hadn't been there during their quiet evening meals or their work in the garden. As Mary handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed, and she noticed how he flinched slightly, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "There's something I need to tell you," the ranch hand finally said, his voice barely audible above the fire's soft crackle. "Something I've never told anyone in Silver Creek." Mary settled back into her chair, one hand resting protectively over her belly. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in Robert's demeanor over these past weeks, the way his shoulders hunched when memories weighed heavily upon him. "Her name was Elizabeth," he began, each word seeming to catch in his throat. "We were to be married in the spring. She fell ill with fever just 2 weeks before our wedding day." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney as Robert described how he had watched helplessly as Elizabeth slipped away, how he had promised her parents he would save her, how he had failed. "I couldn't protect her," he whispered, a tear tracking down his cheek and disappearing into his beard. "And afterward, I couldn't bear to stay. That's when I started drifting, taking whatever work my broken body could manage." Mary felt her own eyes growing damp. She understood loss in ways few others in the village could comprehend. The emptiness of a bed once shared, the silence where laughter should be. "I still feel her absence every day," Robert continued, his hands trembling around the teacup, "and I carry the guilt of not being enough to save her." Without hesitation, Mary reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his. His hand was rough with calluses, warm despite the chill that seemed to emanate from his confession. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we heal not by forgetting our losses, but by sharing them." Robert's fingers tightened around hers, and in that moment, Mary understood that true healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about finding someone who would help you carry it, someone who recognized the scars because they bore their own. The widow and the broken man sat in silence then, connected by intertwined fingers and shared grief, while the fire burned low and the night deepened around their small cottage. Spring arrived in Silver Creek with a fury that no one had anticipated. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, unleashing torrential rains that transformed the dusty paths into rushing streams and turned the main road into an impassable river of mud. The villagers huddled in their homes, whispering prayers as thunder shook the foundations of their dwellings. In Mary Johnson's small cottage, the anxiety was palpable. Her hands trembled as she folded and refolded the baby blankets she had prepared. 8 months pregnant now, her body felt heavy, her movements restricted, and the baby within her seemed to sense the tension in the air, kicking with unusual vigor whenever lightning flashed. "I'm afraid, Robert," she confessed one evening as rain pounded against the windows. "What if the baby comes during the storm? Mrs. Brown won't be able to reach us through these floods." Robert Smith moved carefully across the room, his limp more pronounced in the damp weather that aggravated his old injuries. Yet determination shone in his eyes as he knelt beside her chair. "I've been preparing for this," he said, taking her hand. "Remember what the midwife taught us before she left?" Mary nodded, recalling how the stern woman had reluctantly shared her knowledge after seeing Robert's unwavering dedication. Despite her initial skepticism about the broken ranch hand, Mrs. Brown had eventually recognized his gentle strength. Over the following days, as the storms continued their assault on Silver Creek, Robert's preparations became their sanctuary. He had gathered yarrow and raspberry leaf from the hills, dried them carefully by the fire, and brewed the teas that would strengthen Mary for what lay ahead. Every morning, he checked their supply of clean linens and the extra blankets he had traded for with a passing merchant. "The spring we found is still flowing," he assured her, returning one afternoon drenched but triumphant with fresh water. "Nothing will stop us from having what we need." At night, when Mary woke gasping from dreams of being alone in her labor, she would find him already awake, stoking the fire, his notebook open as he wrote another prayer or lullaby for the child they awaited. "I promised you both protection," he whispered one night, placing his weathered hand gently on her rounded belly. "And I intend to keep that promise." A lightning illuminated their small home and thunder rattled the windows. Mary found herself drawing strength, not from the walls around them, but from the man beside her. The man the town had discarded, the man whose broken body housed an unbreakable spirit. In his steady presence, she discovered a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The night Mary Johnson went into labor, Silver Creek seemed to tremble under the fury of the heavens. Wind rattled the cottage windows like angry fists, and lightning tore open the sky in jagged bursts that illuminated the small room in harsh, fleeting flashes. Each thunderclap felt like a warning, nature itself testing the fragile sanctuary they had built together. "It's coming," Mary whispered, her face contorted with pain as she gripped the edge of the bed. Her knuckles turned white, and beads of sweat formed on her brow despite the chill that had crept into the cottage. Robert Smith moved with surprising steadiness, his usual limp barely noticeable as determination overcame physical limitation. He stoked the fire higher, placed water to boil, and arranged the clean cloths he'd prepared weeks ago. The ranch hand's hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained calm as he spoke soft reassurances. "I'm right here, Mary. We've prepared for this," he said, kneeling beside her. "Remember what Mrs. Brown told us." The midwife had been reluctant to share her knowledge with Robert, viewing him as incapable. Yet she had eventually relented, perhaps seeing something in his earnest dedication that convinced her. Now those precious instructions guided his every move. Another contraction seized Mary, longer and more intense than the last. She cried out, clutching Robert's hand with such force that pain shot through his already damaged fingers. He didn't flinch away. "Breathe through it," he encouraged, demonstrating the pattern the midwife had taught them. Just like that. Outside, the storm raged on, as if challenging their resolve. A particularly violent gust sent a branch crashing against the cottage wall. Mary's eyes widened with fear. "What if something goes wrong?" she gasped between labored breaths. "What if I can't?" "You can," Robert interrupted, his voice firm yet tender. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead. "We can. I won't let anything happen to you or the baby." Hours passed in a blur of pain and waiting. Robert moved between the fireplace and Mary's bedside, brewing the herbal tea that would ease her discomfort, massaging her back when the pain settled there, and whispering encouragements when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Though his body had been broken by years of hard labor and misfortune, his spirit remained undefeated. Each time Mary's strength seemed to falter, he found reserves of courage to share with her. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her, meaning every word. "And soon, you'll hold your child in your arms." As midnight approached and the storm showed no signs of relenting, Robert lit another candle, its warm glow a defiant answer to the darkness that pressed against their windows. They would face this challenge as they had faced every other, together, refusing to surrender to fear or doubt. The night stretched endlessly as Mary Johnson's labor pains intensified. Each contraction felt like a wave, threatening to pull her under. But Robert Smith's steady presence anchored her to hope. Outside, the storm raged with unrelenting fury, thunder cracking like judgment upon their small cottage. "You're doing wonderfully," Robert whispered, wiping sweat from her brow with a damp cloth. His hands, once deemed too broken for useful work, moved with surprising gentleness. "Just a little longer." Mary gripped the edges of her bed, knuckles white with effort. The midwife's warnings echoed in her mind, that this birth might claim her life, that Robert couldn't possibly protect her. Yet here he was, refusing to abandon her when everyone else had. Hours blurred together as the pregnant widow fought for herself and her child. Robert maintained the fire, boiled water, and prepared the herbs he'd gathered weeks before. His limp was more pronounced with exhaustion, but determination straightened his spine. "I can't," Mary gasped after a particularly brutal contraction. "I'm not strong enough." The ranch hand took her hand between both of his. "You are the strongest person I've ever known," he said, his voice unwavering. "And you are not alone." When the moment finally came, Robert positioned himself exactly as Mrs. Brown had reluctantly instructed. Despite his injuries, he remained steady, coaching Mary through each push with words of encouragement that cut through her pain. And then, a miracle. A tiny, indignant cry pierced the howling storm. Relief washed over the cottage as Robert carefully cleaned the newborn with water he'd warmed by the fire. His hands, once mocked for their clumsiness, worked with reverent precision. "A beautiful baby girl," he announced, voice thick with emotion. He wrapped the infant in the softest blanket they owned before placing her in Mary's trembling arms. The new mother gazed down at her daughter's face, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. In that moment, exhaustion gave way to overwhelming joy. The tiny fingers, the perfect nose, the wisps of dark hair, all of it miraculous. "We did it," she whispered, looking up at Robert. His eyes shone with unshed tears, his face illuminated by firelight and something deeper, pride, perhaps, or love. Mary suddenly understood with perfect clarity. This man, whom Silver Creek had dismissed as worthless, had become her protector, her partner, her salvation. Where others had seen only brokenness, she'd found strength. Where she'd expected to face her darkest hour alone, she'd discovered unwavering support. "Thank you," she murmured, reaching for his hand. Robert smiled, the haunted look in his eyes momentarily replaced by pure wonder as he gazed at mother and child. Outside, the storm began to subside, as if nature itself acknowledged the miracle that had occurred within these humble walls. Word of the safe birth spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside Mary Johnson's cottage, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and reluctant admiration. These were the same people who had snickered when she purchased Robert Smith at the auction, who had whispered behind their hands about the foolishness of a pregnant widow taking in a broken man. "I heard the baby came during the worst of the storm," Mrs. Peterson murmured to her neighbor. "And that man, the one with the limp, he delivered it himself." The midwife, Mrs. Brown, stood at the edge of the gathering, her face unreadable. She had warned Mary about the risks, had practically predicted disaster, yet here they were, mother and child alive, thriving even, under the care of a man the town had discarded. "Is it true what they're saying?" someone called out when Robert appeared at the door. "That you delivered the baby yourself?" He nodded, his eyes downcast, uncomfortable with the attention. The ranch hand's hands, once deemed too damaged for proper work, had proven steady when it mattered most. His stooped shoulders seemed straighter now, bearing the weight of his new responsibility with quiet dignity. "Mary and the child are resting," he said simply, his voice stronger than many remembered. Through the open window, villagers caught glimpses of the new mother cradling her infant. The cottage, once viewed as a place of impending tragedy, now radiated an unexpected warmth. Smoke curled from the chimney, herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the sound of a soft lullaby drifted into the yard. Some brought small gifts, a loaf of bread, a knitted blanket, a jar of preserves, offerings that acknowledged what they were beginning to understand. This unlikely pair had created something remarkable from nothing but faith and determination. "Never would have thought he had it in him," the blacksmith muttered, watching as Robert carefully accepted each gift with genuine gratitude. Even the most judgmental villagers found their perspectives shifting. The story of the auction day, once told with mockery, was being reshaped in their retelling, becoming a tale of foresight rather than foolishness, of courage rather than desperation. As the crowd eventually dispersed, their conversations carried a new tone. They had come expecting to confirm their prejudices, but left questioning them instead. The family that had formed against all odds, the widow, the broken man, and the newborn child, had accomplished something profound without intending to. They had shown Silver Creek that true strength often wore the face of vulnerability, and that love could transform even what others had deemed worthless. Robert Smith stood at the edge of the garden, his silhouette softened by the morning light. The townspeople of Silver Creek who passed by no longer averted their eyes or whispered behind raised hands. Instead, many nodded respectfully or offered a genuine good morning. The man they had once dismissed as worthless at the auction block had become something of a local legend. "That's him," mothers would tell their children, "the one who delivered Mary Johnson's baby during the worst storm we've had in years." What they didn't say, but what registered in their eyes, was how his quiet determination had shamed their quick judgments. Robert's limp remained, a permanent reminder of his past injuries, but he carried himself with newfound dignity. His once haunted gaze now held steady when meeting others, reflecting not brokenness, but a hard-won peace. The ranch hand who couldn't find work had become a symbol of quiet strength throughout Silver Creek. Mary, too, had transformed in the eyes of the village. No longer the desperate widow making foolish decisions, she was now admired for her foresight and compassion. Women who had once gossiped about her at the well now asked for her advice on herbs and childcare. The midwife, Mrs. Brown, who had warned her so sternly, now visited regularly, her initial skepticism replaced by grudging respect. "You've proven me wrong," she admitted one afternoon while examining the thriving infant. "I didn't believe he could protect you both." Mary smiled, watching Robert through the window as he repaired a section of fence. "Protection comes in many forms," she replied softly. Together, they had challenged Silver Creek's long-held beliefs about worth and belonging. Their small cottage, once a place of whispered pity, had become a testament to what could be built from apparent brokenness. Villagers who measured value by physical strength or social standing found themselves reconsidering as they witnessed the family's quiet joy. One evening, as they sat by their garden, Robert took Mary's hand. "They see us differently now," he observed. "They see themselves differently," Mary corrected gently. "We've shown them that dignity isn't something you're given by others. It's something you build, day by day." The baby gurgled from the small basket beside them, reaching tiny fingers toward the fading light. Robert smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. In that moment, they understood that their greatest victory wasn't surviving adversity, but redefining what strength truly meant in Silver Creek. Summer sunlight streamed through the cottage windows as Mary Johnson settled into the wooden rocking chair, her newborn nestled against her chest. The gentle rhythm of her movements matched the soft lullaby she hummed, a melody Robert had taught her during those long nights of waiting. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her thumb, a grip so small yet filled with promise. Across the room, Robert Smith moved with growing confidence. His steps, once halting and uncertain, now carried him with only the slightest hint of a limp. The ranch hand, who had arrived broken, was healing alongside the family he'd helped create. Mary noticed how he straightened taller when carrying firewood, how his shoulders no longer hunched forward in perpetual apology for existing. "He's got your eyes," Robert said softly, pausing to gaze at the child. His weathered hands, once clumsy with pain, now moved with surprising gentleness as he stroked the baby's cheek. Mary smiled. "And perhaps your stubborn spirit." Their days fell into a comforting pattern. Mornings began with Robert tending the garden that now flourished behind the cottage. What had started as a few desperate seedlings had transformed into rows of vegetables that promised to see them through the coming months. Mary would watch from the doorway, the baby against her shoulder, marveling at how the man worked the soil with reverence, as if each plant represented another small victory against the hardships they'd faced. Evenings became precious treasures. After simple meals that filled their bellies and hearts, Robert would reach for his worn notebook. The pages that had once held only private dreams now captured their daily life. Sketches of Mary rocking the baby, poems about sunrise over Silver Creek, and prayers of gratitude rather than desperate longing. Sometimes, neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them now stopped by with small offerings: a jar of preserves, a hand-stitched blanket for the baby. Mrs. Brown, the midwife who had doubted Robert's abilities, visited weekly, her stern expression softening when she saw how the child thrived under their care. "I didn't think you'd manage," she admitted one afternoon, watching Robert demonstrate how he'd fashioned a cradle from salvaged wood. "But it seems I was wrong." As twilight settled over their small home each day, Mary would often catch Robert standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the fading light. In those quiet moments, she recognized the look on his face. It was the expression of a man who had found his place in the world after years of drifting. Their cottage had become more than shelter. It had transformed into the sanctuary they both had prayed for during their darkest hours. While many in Silver Creek had begun to accept Mary Johnson and Robert Smith's unconventional family, a small faction remained stubbornly opposed to their happiness. 3 particularly spiteful villagers, led by the blacksmith's wife, began whispering that Robert was secretly stealing from neighboring farms to support Mary and the baby. "I saw him lurking near the Henderson place after dark," the woman claimed at the general store one afternoon, loud enough for others to hear. A broken man like that doesn't change his nature. The rumors spread like wildfire. Soon, Mary noticed cold shoulders and suspicious glances replacing the grudging respect they'd earned. When she visited the village square to trade some of their garden vegetables, several merchants refused her offerings. "We don't take stolen goods," one man said flatly, turning away. Mary returned home with tears streaming down her face. Robert listened quietly, his weathered hands steady as he cradled the baby. "Words can't hurt what we've built," he assured her, though the pain in his eyes betrayed his calm tone. The following morning, they discovered their carefully tended garden had been trampled overnight. Several rows of vegetables lay crushed, and someone had scattered salt over the soil, an old method to render land infertile. Their rabbit traps had been dismantled and tossed into the brush. Mary sank to her knees beside the ruined crops. "How can people be so cruel?" she whispered, clutching a broken tomato plant. Robert knelt beside her, his movements stiff but determined. "They fear what they don't understand," he said softly, "but we won't let them defeat us." That afternoon, while Mary nursed the baby, Robert limped to their hidden spring. He returned with clay-rich soil to mix with their damaged garden bed. Together, they replanted what they could salvage and set new traps farther from the cottage. When Mrs. Brown arrived unexpectedly with medicinal herbs and fresh milk, Mary nearly wept with gratitude. "Not everyone believes those nasty rumors," the midwife said gruffly. "Some of us remember how this man delivered your child during the worst storm in years." Their adversaries hadn't anticipated one crucial thing. Each attack only strengthened the bond between Mary and Robert. They developed signals to alert each other of approaching strangers. They took turns keeping watch at night. Robert taught Mary how to identify which plants would grow fastest to replace their losses. "We're stronger together," Mary told him one evening as they worked side by side, reinforcing their garden fence. "Every challenge they throw at us just proves it." Robert nodded, his eyes reflecting the determination that had carried him through a lifetime of hardship. "Then let them try," he said simply, taking her hand in his. "We'll face it together." The amber glow of sunset painted Silver Creek in hues of gold and crimson as Mary Johnson rocked gently on the porch of her cottage. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, tiny fingers curled around the edge of a handmade blanket. She hummed softly, watching Robert Smith approach from the garden, his limp less pronounced than in those first days after the auction. "I have something for you," Robert said, his voice carrying a rare note of excitement. He pulled his worn notebook from his pocket, the one she had seen him writing in countless evenings by firelight. The leather cover was cracked and faded, bearing the marks of years of handling. Mary shifted the baby to one arm and accepted the notebook with her free hand. "Your poems? Open it," he urged, settling beside her on the wooden bench they had built together during her final months of pregnancy. She carefully turned the pages, past familiar sketches and prayers, until she reached fresh writing, a poem titled simply, "For My Family." The handwriting was deliberate, each word chosen with care. As Mary read, tears welled in her eyes. Robert had captured their journey, from the auction block to this moment, in verses that spoke of second chances, of finding light in darkness, of building love from the ashes of loss. "I never thought I'd have this again," Robert whispered, his calloused finger gently touching the baby's cheek. "A home, purpose, someone to care for." The widow looked up from the page, remembering how the villagers had laughed when she bid on this man, how Mrs. Brown had warned her about taking such risks, how her own heart had trembled with uncertainty. All those nights I prayed for protection, Mary confessed. I never imagined it would come in the form of someone who needed healing as much as I did. Robert took her hand, his touch gentle yet strong. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in hardship. The baby stirred, making soft noises that brought smiles to both their faces. In those innocent sounds, they heard the future, a future they would build together, day by day, challenge by challenge. Every test we face makes us stronger, Mary said, closing the notebook and holding it against her heart. Every struggle brings us closer. As twilight deepened around their small cottage, Mary realized that love hadn't arrived in the way she had expected, in grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Instead, it had come through shared pain, through daily acts of courage, through a broken man's determination to be more than his wounds. And in that understanding, she found a peace she had never known before. The cottage that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the delighted squeals of Mary Johnson's baby. Little Sarah, named after Robert's mother, had grown into a chubby-cheeked infant whose laughter seemed to chase away the shadows that had once clung to every corner of their home. Robert sat by the window, whittling a small wooden horse, as the afternoon sun caught in his hair. His hands, once deemed too damaged to be of use, moved with surprising grace. The limp that had once marked him as broken in the village's eyes was now just one part of who he was, not a definition, but a chapter in a longer story. "She has your eyes," Mary said, watching him from where she sat nursing the baby. "And your stubbornness, too." He smiled, the expression transforming his once haunted face. "And your strength," he replied softly. "Heaven help us all when she learns to walk." The ranch hand who had stood trembling on the auction block was unrecognizable in this man, who moved with quiet purpose through their shared life. His injuries, once a source of mockery, now stood as testament to what he had survived and what he had built despite them. Mary watched him with the baby later that evening, his large hands impossibly gentle, as he rocked Sarah to sleep. She remembered how she had once feared endless solitude, trapped in whispers and judgment after her first husband's death. Now she understood that her story had never been about loss alone. It was about finding connection in unexpected places. Their small garden flourished outside, vegetables growing in neat rows where Robert had worked the soil each morning. The hidden spring they had discovered continued to provide clear water, and the traps he had taught her to set ensured they never went hungry. What had begun as mere survival had transformed into something richer. "I never thought I could feel this way again," Mary whispered one night as they sat by the fire, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. He took her hand, his fingers calloused but tender. "Neither did I." The widow who had once walked through Silver Creek with downcast eyes now stood tall. She had learned that family wasn't just what you were born into or what others approved of. It was what you built together, day by day, through storms and sunshine alike. As Sarah grew stronger, so did they. Their cottage, once a place of refuge from judgment, had become a home built on something the villagers had never understood: that sometimes what appears broken is merely waiting for the right hands to reveal its true strength. As the seasons changed over Silver Creek, the story of Mary Johnson and Robert Smith took root in the community's collective memory. What had begun as a desperate gamble at an auction block transformed into a tale passed down through generations, a testament to faith rewarded and prayers answered in unexpected ways. Mary often stood at her cottage door, watching her child play in the garden Robert had carefully tended. The ranch hand who once stooped with pain now moved with quiet confidence, his injuries a badge of the journey they'd traveled together. When neighbors passed by, they no longer whispered cruel judgments, but offered respectful nods and genuine smiles. "I never thought I'd find peace here," Mary confessed one evening as they sat beside the fire. "I was so afraid of facing life alone." Robert took her hand, his weathered fingers gentle against hers. "And I never imagined anyone would see value in what was left of me," he replied, his voice steady with the certainty that had replaced his former despair. Their home had become a sanctuary for others facing hardship. Young widows sought Mary's counsel, while men broken by circumstance found hope in Robert's quiet resilience. Mrs. Brown, who had once warned against their union, now regularly visited, bringing small gifts for the child and reluctant admiration for the family's strength. "You've changed how people see possibility," the midwife admitted during one such visit. "Not just in Silver Creek, but in themselves." The hidden spring they had discovered continued to nourish their garden, much as their partnership sustained their spirits. They had learned that love wasn't always announced with grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it arrived disguised as necessity, revealing its true nature only to those brave enough to nurture it through hardship. On the anniversary of the auction, Mary placed a wildflower in Robert's worn notebook, now filled with years of poems, sketches, and memories. "Of all the answers to prayer," she whispered, "you were the one I least expected and needed most." The village that had once laughed now looked to their example when facing their own trials. The widow and the broken man had shown that worth wasn't determined by others' judgment, but by the courage to see beyond surface wounds to the heart beneath. And in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, when their child slept peacefully and the cottage stood strong against the wind, Mary and Robert recognized the miracle they'd created. Not just survival, but a love that had transformed them both, healing what had been broken and fulfilling what had been promised in their most desperate prayers.